Hey, welcome to Next Level Method Podcast. I'm Richard Ryerson.
And I'm Matt Lilly.
And we're here to help you take your life to the next level. Let's get started. Well, Ryan Bush on the show.
Yes.
I knew this was going to be we need a name for these. Brainbuster?
Our special Brainbuster episode. Yeah.
These guests are really pushing my knowledge limit, but it's so much fun, right?
Yeah,
I mean, I feel like my brain gets a workout.
Yeah.
I was reading his book this morning and then having him on the show. I mean, he is a designer and thinker focused on building better systems, better people, better future. I originally thought when I read his book that he was like some kind of like psychologist.
Yeah.
But he's not, right?
No, I think
he's a guy that understands
designs. He's like an engineer, right?
Right.
Which makes it more, I mean, I think that's what we liked about his material. It's very pragmatic and it's very science-based, but also philosophy, right? He calls it.
It goes back to the ancients, right?
Yeah.
A lot of his stuff is from the thinkers of Lao Tzu, the Buddha, Marcus Aurelius, which I'm a huge fan of.
Right.
Meditations, Nietzsche, Aristotle.
Yeah. And so he's drawn from that ancient wisdom, but then, so he basically is drawn from this ancient, I would call that philosophy if you want to call it that, but then he's also putting science behind it and saying, well, there's actually algorithms here underlying. So if Aristotle said something or Aurelius said something, they said it, but here's the algorithm that fuels that thought.
Right.
And then here's how to basically decide if you want to change that algorithm, right?
Right, and that's the point, right? I think we all know, I mean, that's kind of the reason why we
do what we do.
Method, right?
Exactly.
It's like is really rewiring the algorithms in our brain.
Right.
And his book, Designing the Mind, really gets into laying the groundwork of why it's important, right? I mean, I think intuitively we all want to try to get to the next level.
Yeah, have a better life, right? Happier, more joyful, more fulfilled, right?
Significant life.
Yes,
right?
of
all
course.
Those kind of things. And he really breaks it down like, okay, if we're going to do that, we got to understand what mindfulness means, which we talk about a lot.
Yeah.
So I learned from this is like not only the mindfulness piece, but once we get to that state, now that's the point where you can look down and say, oh, okay, I see what I'm doing here. Right.
And do something with it, right? It's one thing to make your mind peaceful and calm, which is extremely important. But once you get to peaceful and calm, then what do you want to do from there?
Right.
Right.
I know. I think he's great.
Yeah, I think he is too.
I think he's on to really something. And the way he's written his book, I kind of kid and say it was blowing my mind, but he has of all the books that I read in this, he does a really good job of explaining it in a pragmatic and straightforward way. Right. And it comes across in his conversation too, right?
Really great guy, and excited that, he came on the show, and I think we'll be seeing more of him here at Next Level because he's, we love people in space. We have great guests on the show every week, and he's another example of great guests that are really thought leaders in their space or experts in their space, and they can really share their value. And obviously we put links and everything for people to explore more, because this is kind of the introduction, but there's a lot more there for you in the podcast itself, and then obviously in his work.
Yep. And he's got a bonus here, a free book of self-mastery.
Yeah, that's right.
He's giving it away. It's a great and generous offer.
Yep.
It's designingthemind.org/free-mastery, or you can find the link in the show notes, either here on YouTube or at our website, nextlevelmethod.com.
Yes.
And go check out nextlevelmethod.com to learn more about all the services that we provide, all the upcoming live events that we got scheduled in 2021 and 2022, building this community all around energy, elimination, relationships, and purpose. And we encourage you to join and sign up on our email list, and also follow us on your favorite podcast application, whatever it may be. It does wonders as we're trying to get noticed in this sea of 2.8 million podcasts now. And so your support, your subscribing, writing a review will do wonders to help us get more noticed. Again, thanks for being a supporter, and let's get on with this conversation
with Ryan Bush.
Ryan Bush here on Next Level Method. Well, Ryan, so excited to meet you. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, excited to be here. Thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah.
Where do we start? Designing the Mind is the name of the book. Let's just get that out there. And I was reading this, like I was telling you before, I was kind of half jokingly that I was reading it all morning, and my mind's about to explode. So much good stuff, man.
Yeah.
I'm with you. By trade, you're kind of, you kind of naturally go to systems, right? In understanding systems. I was a computer science major. I was kind of that same way, right? I think my mind is kind of where I gravitate toward those things. But I love the premise here. I mean, it's nothing new in the sense that, our mind is like one big computer, and it's a bunch of algorithms, and how do we change it? But I like the way that you approach this about how we can kind of, use the wisdom of the ancients, the stuff that's been around for a long time. You don't promise to be a guru. You don't promise to be coming up with something new, patented, the 12 steps from Ryan, how to rewire your brain. I love the approach, and I was really drawn into it at the beginning by you explaining that. So I don't know. You got this new term that I never heard before, psychitecture. So let's start there. What is psychitecture?
Yeah, psychitecture is sort of like what it sounds like. It's like a combination of psychology and architecture. So it's about kind of rewiring, restructuring, and redesigning your own mind, and in the sense of psychological software is the way I like to think about it. So yeah, kind of like you're saying, there are a lot of books out there, particularly in the self-help space, that sort of cover the same ground, regurgitate the same material, and I'm kind of trying to take a step back and look at all these different insights that are clearly valuable, and say how can we integrate these into a common framework, and how can we actually sort of rationally engineer them, as opposed to the sort of vague, inspirational, feel-good ideas, right? What are the real nuts and bolts? How do
Mm-hmm.
these things work? And kind of like you touched on, it's really all about systems. Like you said, I'm a systems designer. That's the term I use for it. So I've worked on everything from physical products to software to broader interacting components and things like that. And I think we have a tendency to look at the events going on around us purely as single instances. And we do the same with our mind, right? We look at our emotions and our thoughts and our biases and our bad habits and all these things, and we often don't recognize the patterns that are sort of under the surface and how
Right.
they interact with one another. So I'm really looking at how thoughts and emotions and behaviors are these sort of interconnected algorithms inside our minds. And I'm saying, what wisdom do we have that's out there, anywhere from Stoicism to Buddhism to modern positive psychology, that can reveal the leverage points for actually changing these algorithms and improving our minds in a very practical, rational sense.
I like the idea that this kind of coding or wiring that's been kind of passed down for maybe even millions of years.
Mm-hmm.
I never thought about it that way. That maybe take, for example, I think jealousy is one of them that you gave me an example, that maybe that's there genetically for millions of years to help our survival, but it
Right.
doesn't serve us. Am I saying that right? Am I saying that the right way? I think I never looked at it that way, but you're absolutely right. That maybe that
Yeah.
reason why I get
Mm-hmm.
anxious or angry, or I tend to have this certain habit, maybe because of some wiring that happened
Mm-hmm.
over time that was there for our survival. For you can give the example like, look, I don't want to get up and stand in front of 10,000 people and give a speech because I may embarrass myself, and then no girls are going to like me, and I'm not going to propagate my,
Right.
I'm not going to reproduce. I mean, that sounds silly, but it's like, wow, I never looked at it that way. Maybe that's,
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to. I'm going to stay under the radar so I don't make a fool of myself. But now in
Yeah.
today's society, maybe I am the next, TED sensation that's going to go viral, right? Maybe I was meant to be a speaker if I can just rewire and start serving it the better way. I said a lot there, but does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Totally. Yeah. There's really sort of two problems with the way that our brains are wired. Two core problems. One of them is that we're not meant for ourselves. Aristotle sort of said, well, a good human being is a human being who functions the way that they were designed to function, right? And when you really look at it, that doesn't fully make sense, because we were designed to pass on our genes. That's essentially what created the human
Mm-hmm.
algorithm, is the best possible gene propagator. And so, in the environment of our ancestors. So the first problem is that although they overlap from time to time, even a lot of the time, we're not optimized for maximum well-being and wisdom and altruism and all these things that we value, right? So we need to rewire ourselves purely because we weren't really made for ourselves. And then the second issue is, like you said, in the modern world, there are all these things that are different from our evolutionary environment in which our ancestors evolved. So there are so many examples of issues that are created purely because we're still running on 100,000-year-old software that hasn't had time to update to the world around us. So yeah, like you said, public speaking is a huge issue. Obesity. Randolph Ness called social obesity. That's the result of these modern social media platforms that we haven't had time to adapt to. So there are all these reasons why our minds by default are not ideal, and we have to do the work to get closer and closer to that ideal mind.
Yeah, there's a lot here we could just play with all day, couldn't we? So I'm always curious of our guests because obviously it's actually very profound work that you're working on here, and you shared with us some new stuff you're working on, and we'll get to that. But what motivated you? What drove you? Why are you? I mean, because if I'm looking at, I'm like, well, he's not a psychiatrist, right? You didn't study psychology specifically in school, although now I think you would probably qualify as a psychologist. But I mean, why the book? Why the and when I was listening to another podcast you did, basically the book came from just your own personal study, right?
Right. So yeah, if I had to pick a word to describe myself, I would say I'm an obsessive in that I've got these things that I'm very passionate about, and then I had this interest that came about in me, before I was even reading any of this other source material. I was just kind of asking the same kind of questions on my own that I feel like some of these ancient thinkers were asking themselves. I think some people just are wired to be really curious about that kind of thing. So even before I had my career path as a designer, I really was first and foremost this kind of armchair philosopher psychologist, and I was, experimenting with my own mind. I was trying to see what I could change and control inside myself. What beliefs could I alter? What emotional responses that we tend to think are fixed can I sort of jump in and intervene with? And I sort of got that's one of those big things that would excite me, is when I could find a way to change my default response to something. And then I started reading more and more. I got deeper into the philosophy, practical philosophy, and psychology rabbit holes, and I got to where I had thousands of notes that I had taken on my phone, just an unwieldy amount of disorganized information, and I said, I have to do something with this. I've got enough here that I can create a work that would be valuable to other people at this point, just from a decade or so of asking questions. And that's kind of what led to this. I don't I'm not one to feel like I need an institution's permission to sort of develop knowledge and mastery. So it's never been important for me to go and get a degree or a PhD or whatever in these topics, because I can find all this information and sort of organize it and master it myself. So I'm kind of a DIY happiness hacker researcher kind of guy.
Right.
Well, go ahead.
Well, I just the other thing. So as we were, doing our due diligence and researching your stuff and reading through your stuff, I've noticed, and I'm assuming this is I know it's on purpose, but you don't put your name on the book, right? It's not on this book. It's not on this. As an author, typically when we see a book, right, on that spine we see the author's name, and there's a few exceptions to that. But I'm curious. I'm sure that was a conscious thing, right?
It was a conscious thing. I'll admit it was a bit of a compromise between two different things I wanted to do. One was to go the full on, I am the face of this company, and the other was to be completely anonymous.
Right.
And I kind of liked the idea of being anonymous. I don't necessarily want to be in the spotlight, and I really want it to be more about the ideas than the person and the face behind it. And I suspect that in my next book I'll probably just do the normal thing and put my name on the cover and all that. But I don't regret doing it this way, because I think it does give it a kind of intrigue and almost makes it feel larger than a single person. This is Designing the Mind is the author of Designing the Mind. And theoretically, at some point I may have a team of people helping me put together these books, so it really won't just be me. But at this point, Designing the Mind is synonymous with me. So
sure, yeah.
So,
and is it the hope that, I think all of us intuitively know that we know that the brain, the mind is so much more powerful. Like, we're not even using close to the capacity. But some of us have just resigned to the fact, like, well, I don't know how to tap into that, unused 98% or whatever that percentage is, right? And is it your hope that people begin to understand, is like, look, I mean, it can be so much more, right? Life can be so much more. You can be so much more. Is that what's driving this?
Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of kind of defeatist ideas in our culture that say like you should just accept who you are. You can't control, you can't change, you
Right.
can't engineer these things. And ultimately, it's rooted in wisdom. There's a lot of Eastern wisdom, for example, that's all about kind of letting go and accepting and awareness. And ultimately, this is all really valid preliminary steps. I mean, you do need to accept where you're at right now, but that in no way means that you can't work to change it. And so, a lot of these ideas, I'm shedding light on the well documented power of emotional self regulation. Right? A lot of people really believe that you can't help how you feel, you can't change your feelings, and it's not necessarily ideal to always change your feelings. It's not necessarily the best to just numb yourself to all negative emotions. In some cases, you'll want those emotions to drive you and push you toward the right things. But once you recognize that these emotions and these different things aren't necessarily here for your benefit, they can be, but they're not automatically these wise teachers inside your mind, then you kind of see you have the ability and that you really should do the work to develop a proficiency and a self-mastery in changing the aspects of yourself that don't sort of lead towards your ideal self.
And the ultimate benefit is what? I mean, I understand that. I mean, you using your words is like it's up to us to carve out the path towards this psychological well-being, or the peak of psychological well-being. And again, I think I know the answer to this, but I just want to hear you. So what? Why? Why is that? Why do we need to do that?
Right. A few different answers. So I'll kind of go in, there's three realms that I lay out, right? One of them is cognitive, one's emotional, and one's behavioral, right? So, I mean, from just looking at a sociological standpoint, I think one of our biggest, if not the single biggest threat to us as a species and risk to us as a society is the fact that we are these biased, essentially Pleistocene beings, and we're trying to operate with such massive complexity and power, so much knowledge, so much technology, right? It's threatening society in a way that it couldn't have before, right? So that's just the very first answer, is that collectively it's not sustainable for us to keep operating with these biased minds. We have to work to overcome it in ourselves, and often the solutions that you hear are sort of external solutions, right? But I think each individual needs to sort of develop this interest in turning themselves into this clearer thinker. In the emotional realm, right, of course we all want to be happier, right? And it really is a lot of low-hanging fruit that can allow you to become happier by changing these emotions and getting closer to equanimity and peace, right? And then behaviorally, and really this kind of sums up all of them, is that we want to get closer to our ideal selves, right? I happen to think that the closer or further away that we are from our ideal selves is essentially the degree of deep well-being that we'll realize. Mm-hmm. So, when you take a step to get closer to that person that you really would like to be, that embodies all of your highest values, right? I think that is essentially what really regulates your happiness and what makes you happier, as opposed to, the kind of external achievements and possessions that most people sort of think bring happiness, and then they're surprised when it doesn't, right? So really all of the things that we value can be gotten closer to by making modifications to our own minds, right? So in that sense, there's every reason to do this, because everything that you could possibly care about can be achieved and embodied and sort of resembled through your own efforts to change your own systemic patterns.
So it's basically saving the world, is what you're saying. Right? Saving ourselves and saving the world, right?
In a nutshell.
Yeah.
In a summary.
I love that answer, and I think you're right. This is why we're doing this podcast. That's why we do these things. We pursue these things. Everybody's got this hunger, this gnawing. There's something more, right? And I love how you approach it. I'm curious what I know when I started turning to the Stoics, when I turned to Marcus Aurelius or I turned to Seneca, that really helped me kind of, maybe I just started scratching the surface and started reprogramming the algorithm in my mind. I got a great deal of satisfaction out of when I study that, right? And it changed my perspective. What is it about the Stoics that you think that all of us can benefit from? I mean, because this is thousands of years of wisdom and knowledge, right? Or even Aristotle. Yeah. And Aristotle wasn't so much of a Stoic, I guess. I mean, he had some elements of Stoicism, but what is it about Stoicism that you find attractive or that we need to know?
Yeah, Stoicism is quite possibly the number one influence on these ideas. And when you study Stoicism, you find that they were trying to do the same thing, thousands of years ago. The human mind has not changed fundamentally, right? And they were looking in themselves, and they were essentially asking, what changes can I make to the way I deal with the world, the way I deal with my life, and the way I deal with circumstances that I can't necessarily control. So it's this idea of not trying so hard to control the things that are out of our control, and working more and more to control our own responses, our own interpretations, and our own emotions in response to those things. And really, it's I mean, you can see it just by reading one of these books, like the Enchiridion or Meditations, right? You start noticing, wow, this is already like having this effect, right? I mean, it makes so much sense that I wouldn't, for example, expect everything to go according to my plan. I wouldn't expect to go about my day and not meet any difficult people, right? It makes total sense once you start reading it. Yeah, of course I'm going about this the wrong way. And you start coming across these different tricks that I've sort of represented as these algorithms, these open source snippets of code that the ancients gave us. You've got the negative visualization where you can sort of practice this reflection on the things that you inevitably can and will lose, the things that can go wrong, the way that your life may not go according to plan. And when you start making a habit of this, you start, one, developing more gratitude for the things that you do have in your life, but two, it doesn't hit you as hard when you lose these things if you're mentally prepared for them. Right, so that's just one example of probably hundreds of algorithms that you can find sprinkled through the books that can improve your mind. And that was one of the first influences, and still is one of my greatest influences that helps me sort of make improvements to my software. Right.
Yeah, I love that. I agree with you. I think, and that's why I was really curious as you were bringing up. I see a lot of stoicism within this, and I think that's great. But I don't know. Is Stoicism big with you, or have you studied much of them?
Not enough. Honestly, not enough. It's not from a purist standpoint. I would say, it's basically I've got concepts that I've studied that work and some that don't work, and they've come through ancient teachings. I wouldn't be able to pinpoint back and say that's who said that and that's where it came from. I've learned from people who were using those teachings, but not necessarily studied it myself, which I love in your book. You just quote a lot of that, right? I mean, that's, like you said, it's the basis of your work.
Yeah, that's one of the big bases. And yeah, I mean, you can definitely get into these ideas through the sort of popular teachings, but it does go deeper once you get into the actual ancients. I mean, you could study Stoicism in a secondhand form and not even know the role of virtue, for example, which was really at the heart of Stoicism. The whole idea is that none of the circumstances that matter, none of the circumstances that happen to you in your life actually are what matters. They're not good or bad. They just sort of have the illusion of being good or bad. That's the part everyone knows. The part that is less known is that they say that virtue is essentially the only true good, which means not just virtue in the sense of morality, but essentially the character traits and strengths that you demonstrate in response to these things are essentially the real sort of landscape of well-being and of the good life. So essentially, once you really get into it, it starts training you to think, not to put less weight on the things that are happening to you and a lot more weight on the way that you are sort of displaying your character traits in response to them.
So we've established that the way that your mind is structured is going to determine the person that we're going to become, right? I mean, this is the truth that we need to kind of embrace, and the life that we live and the fulfillment that we realize is really up to us. I mean, I think intuitively we know that. The problem is we don't know how to.
Yeah, what's the operational?
Yeah, how do we change the operating
Right,
system?
right.
And you talk about metacognition and mindfulness. I know mindfulness is a big deal between Matt and myself. But you say that mindfulness doesn't go like what we kind of see mindfulness, or kind of the popular conception of mindfulness, doesn't take it far enough. Can you explain that to me? Because if we're gonna, as you put it, we're gonna have to, before we rewire it, we're gonna have to get outside and look down and see how it's all having that self-awareness, and mindfulness is the way that to get there, right? But you say they don't, the present way that it's talked about, it doesn't go far enough. So explain that to me.
Yeah, it just seems that most of the literature on mindfulness talks about mindfulness for the sake of mindfulness, essentially. Like develop that awareness of what's going on in your mind, and then you're done. Do it some more, right? They don't often go the step further that I think is really important. And I have to wonder if people are, meditating and developing this metacognitive awareness, this awareness of what's going on in their own mind, and then they don't instinctively know to take it a step further and to actually engage in psychitecture, right? So, I kind of, almost intuitively, when I should have been paying more attention to like the physical world around me or the social interactions or whatever, I have a inclination to pay attention to what's going on in my own mind, right? I feel like most people don't. Most people have to have, a really regular practice to sort of turn off this monkey mind and actually observe what's going on in there. But once you do that, there's this whole world of, kind of changing those responses, not just awareness of what's going on, but the ability to then step back and say, okay, I can see that I'm having this response. I can see that every time my coworker makes this comment to me that I go into this whole, emotional spiral, right? But now I have to ask, what are the leverage points? How can I actually jump in and change it so I don't have that reaction anymore, right? So yes, mindfulness and metacognition are essential prerequisites to this whole world of psychitecture, but you can go further and actually start changing these things.
Yeah, I love that, how mindfulness, the point of it is to weaken the shield around the algorithm, right? That's, to me, that was kind of the aha moment for me. It's like, oh, okay, so yeah, I think I'm with you on that. I think I was in the camp of like, okay, I get mindfulness so I can be this at peace all the time, and that I can always have this kind of calm demeanor about it. But you take it a step further and saying, well, that's all good and well, but let's use it so that we can find the weak areas in the algorithm, so I can start diving in and rewiring, right?
Right, exactly.
But I still don't know how to rewire.
Yeah, so let's go the next step, right? For the practical,
how do we
for the
rewire?
practical application, walk us through something if you don't mind.
Sure. So, yeah, I mean, there's so many different ways you could take this. Right now, I've been immersed in ideas on anxiety because I'm developing a sort of tranquility training program and a course on the anxiety algorithm. The book was able to cover a lot of ground as this sort of broad synthesis, but unfortunately, I wasn't able to go super deep into any one topic. So right now, that's essentially what I'm doing. And I'm spending months reading everything I can get my hands on, essentially until I can't find a book that teaches me something new on anxiety, or a new study or a new, course, right? So one of the ways that we can apply this, the anxiety algorithm, as I have come to understand it, essentially has 4 components, right? So you've got I kind of call them all by an A alliteration. So you've got the antecedent, which is the input, the external stimulus in your environment, right? Then you've got arousal, which is the emotional, sort of physiological reaction. And then you've got the appraisal, which is your mental sort of interpretation of what's going on. And then you've got the action that you take at the end. And this algorithm is essentially put in place to cause you to avoid things that might be dangerous in your environment. So it's a perfectly good algorithm in theory. But most of us don't complain about having anxiety when we're like about to fall off of a cliff or when a bear comes up to us. Most of us have anxiety that causes us to interpret totally not dangerous things as dangerous, and it prevents us from really, reaching those ideals and aspirations, right? So in each case, for each of these four nodes, essentially, our natural instinct is to escape and avoid, right? That's how it's set up. So the intuitive thing, when you encounter something that triggers a fear response, your instinct is to avoid it, right? When you have these physiological responses that we might call panic, your natural instinct is to say, okay, I need to find a way to relax. I need to do breathing exercises. I need to make my heart rate go down. I'm going to have a heart attack, and then, with the interpretations, we start having these worries, and we start trying to push the thoughts away and sort of brute force suppress them, distract ourselves, replace it with positive thinking. A lot of self-help says to do that. And then, with the final action, we have these escape behaviors, whether it's literal escape or, something like alcohol or drugs or overeating, a different form of escape. And essentially, the key to beating these feedback loops that exist that sort of reinforce and maintain the vicious cycle of anxiety is to, in pretty much every case, do the opposite of your natural intuition. So instead of escape, you want to embrace, essentially. And you want to ride the wave of this anxious experience. So, one of the ways that you do this is through exposure therapy, which is one of the most effective treatments for anxiety and particularly fears and phobias out there. So you essentially create this list, this hierarchy of various anxiety triggering situations, starting with the easiest and getting harder. So let's say you have social anxiety, which a lot of people today deal with in varying degrees, right? You could start this by just going into a public grocery store, which most people don't have a problem with. Some people really can't do. And then you can get more extreme, and you essentially create this list, and you rank out, okay, this would trigger my anxiety to a number 2 out of 10, right? This would trigger to a 3. You go all the way down, and you set dates to each of these things. You put yourself in those situations in increasing degrees, and then you make sure to stay in the situation long enough that it triggers your anxiety, and then you stay there until the anxiety reduces to about 50% of the initial response. And then you can leave. If you escape the situation when your anxiety is at its peak, you'll essentially just maintain the anxiety, right? And this is why, it's sort of our natural instinct to do all these things. So essentially, in all of these cases, your leverage point gives you the ability, if you have the mindfulness to observe and say, okay, this is what's happening in my mind. I notice that I'm having this anxious experience, to choose to stay in that experience and to embrace the uncomfortable feelings and to sort of ride the wave of anxiety until it subsides. That is essentially how you rewire and sort of hijack that natural anxiety experience and get yourself to a lower level of anxiety. And personally, I've actually been working to apply this in my own life in a way without knowing it. I've been doing it since I was really young, but recently I've been working to get better with my fear of heights because everyone has a little bit of a fear of heights, but I literally go to a rock climbing gym multiple times a month, and I've never climbed above 10 or 15 feet on the wall. And mostly I do the bouldering where you're not even harnessed in and you're not going that high. But I had sort of accepted that I just had this fear that was built into me, that I was just different. I just had too strong of a fear of anxiety. And then once I started studying this, I was like, well, why would I accept that? The whole point of what I'm talking about is to change it. But you're almost skeptical that you actually can make these changes. So I was like, no, I don't think that'll work in my head. But I was like, I'm going to apply it. And literally within a day of actually using these methods, I was going 2-3 times higher and not even thinking anything of it than I had before. And it's just shocking how fast this actually works when you apply it properly. Right? There are ways you can do it wrong and ways to even make it worse if you're not applying it properly. But often, what people are doing to seemingly try to get rid of their anxiety is actually what's maintaining it. And if you do the opposite, you really can make huge results very quickly.
Yeah, it's a great point, is that a lot of the anxiety that we feel, whatever, or is our own mind creating a situation that isn't truth, right? And so to counter it, I mean, I guess intuitively it makes sense. We've heard that. I mean, I guess it'd be no different if I was afraid of swimming. But my dad, how he grew up, probably wouldn't be the best, right? He says, well, he's just going to throw me in a pond.
right. And you'll
that,
figure it out.
That would probably make it worse, right? And so what
it's not controlled.
It's not controlled. It's not graduated.
Right.
And just like with you with heights, it's like, well, I'm going to start by just climbing this ladder towards my roof and just kind of hang out there. And so what you're saying is happening is this rewiring. And then the next I go, then I'm going to go to rock climbing at the Y, and so on and so forth. Yeah, you wouldn't want to go, okay, I'm going to overcome this fear of heights, and you're going to jump out of a plane the next day, right? I mean, that would just that would be the wrong way to do it.
You know, the crazy thing is that last week I was at a talk, and I can't remember the author's name, but he wrote a book, Fear is Fuel.
Mm-hmm.
And he talked about, he had a fear. Have you know the guy, or have you heard?
It sounds familiar.
Yeah.
I haven't read it.
Yeah, Fear is Fuel. And so he basically had a life, changing experience in the hospital. He thought he was going to, I mean, the surgeon told him, or not the surgeon, the doctor told him to get his affairs in order. He had 0 white blood cells. They didn't know why, thought he was going to die. And so he looked at his life and he saw all the regret that he had from his anxiety and his fear. And so he was afraid to fly, right? Like afraid to get on a commercial plane. He was afraid, so he terrified, so he wouldn't take his family on vacation. He just thought about all the stuff. And so he did exactly kind of what you talked about. He started, so he obviously lived, but then he decided he had to get his pilot's license because he had to be able to overcome this anxiety. So he got his pilot's license, and he said for the first 4 lessons, he was just terrified. And then by the 5th one, he actually started to smile and then started to enjoy it. It was a very visceral experience. Then he was looking at all the dials and how, and it became, and then he didn't stop, right? So he got his pilot's license, and he got his instrument rating. Then he got his commercial license, and then he got his stunt. So he was in town. He was here in Wichita doing a talk, and he was out in a Stearman plane doing loop-to-loops and stuff, but he said that really it rewired his brain, right? And we were actually, I have a little fear of heights, but I've kind of overcome it based on kind of what you've talked about. And, we had a big scaffolding, and we got to rappel off the scaffolding and kind of feel the, where you feel it in your body and stuff. But I kind of get what you're saying. It's the exposure, right? It's almost like desensitization, if I can say that word, right? You're kind of desensitizing yourself to. And I was even thinking like natural immunity, right? You're kind of naturally immunizing yourself from the thing from the anxiety, right?
Well, yeah,
absolutely, yeah, and really that's just the sort of fear phobia component. We could go into panic disorder, we could go into worry and overthinking and stress, and we could go into the behavioral issues. But that's sort of this one example, and yeah, absolutely. I mean, I totally relate to what you're talking about, because when I said that I've been applying this for years, I couldn't have articulated it at the time, obviously, but when I was in 7th grade, I had pretty extreme like social anxiety. I was very introverted. I was pretty much scared of the world. I didn't know how to talk to people, and I sort of intuitively knew that I had to do something about it, even though I didn't quite know why. And I went out and joined the football team, which for some people is just what they do, but very much like a chess team type of guy.
Right.
I ended up playing on the football team for like 5 years, and it was one of the best ways to just totally destroy that fear of so many things, because it I can go on a podcast now and think back to how nervous I was before, a football game or something, and think, well, at least I'm not doing that right now. But yeah, in a way, this is all a part of an ongoing exposure therapy for me. Public speaking, going on podcasts. I've done a lot of really nerve-wracking things even before I knew what exposure therapy was, because I knew that was the path to getting closer to my ideal self and becoming a person that I fully approved of, by going through that path and forcing myself out of my comfort zone.
I think we all have. I mean, we all have experiences that. I mean, I certainly can go back and say, hey, yeah, I've done this, and I look back 40 years ago, and I'm like, I had no idea I'd be doing this, and it's because I took the leap and everything else. So I think that's great, but I think that the thing that we definitely need to celebrate, or the fact to take it another level further, is really realizing that this is rewiring the brain. So if we
Right.
can do it for phobias and fears, which is kind of the low-hanging fruit, what else can we do it for, right? And I think that's, to me, the exciting thing about what you're trying to present. Because I think intuitively we know that, hey, to get over your fear of swimming, become a swimmer, right? That's not new, but what is new to me is, okay, what's actually happening here, right? I have the ability to kind of, I'm in more control than I give myself credit for. I think that if I get over the fear of swimming or heights, I never took the time to realize, well, how did I do that, and what else? What's next? What else can I do?
Well, and I think, and we'll certainly, let Ryan speak to the actual evidence here. But, I think as you do that in one area, then it kind of undoes that pattern, right? And so at the very least, you have the confidence to go, oh, I changed this. I changed my fear of heights. So what else can I change, right? What else can I do? But I've got to think that it not only does that as a concept, but actually physically rewires the brain so that it's just more and more access to be able to accomplish more or I don't know if you want to say accomplish more and more or let go of more and more. I don't know how you want to frame that. I mean, let go of more concepts, because I guess as you kind of phrased it earlier, we've kind of unpacked or undid that algorithm, right? So it has less power in other areas of our life, I would assume, because at the base of that's got to be fear, right? At the base of that algorithm is probably most of the negative ones is some type of fear. Is that accurate? No. I mean, based on what you've...
Well, I in that case, I call it the anxiety algorithm, but I think you make, a really interesting point, which is that, once we start rewiring certain neural pathways, we're actually sort of building a meta pathway of cognitive change. So we're getting to where it's more intuitive to us that we can change these things, and it gets easier and easier to change other things. And then also, changing one thing can very much have a chain reaction to a lot of other algorithms. Like depression and anxiety are deeply intertwined. So if you are able to, fix one of those, it will very often start having positive effects for another. To go into another example, I mean, depression is one of these things that has been dealt with really effectively through cognitive therapy and through cognitive restructuring, right? And essentially, when people start to develop these feelings of failure and inadequacy, and it starts to result in this really low self-esteem, they start getting depressed, right? One of the most effective, empirically effective methods for doing it, for sort of changing these depressive algorithms, is to, do cognitive restructuring. So where you actually take a note of what situations are essentially triggering these negative feelings, what are the feelings that you're responding with, and then crucially, what are the thoughts that accompany them? What are the cognitive interpretations that you're putting on those things? Because when you compare people who are depressed and people who aren't depressed, you find that depressed people very often have this really distorted negative spin that they're putting on the things that are happening to them, right? So what cognitive therapy does, and specifically the technique of cognitive restructuring, is it causes you to start noticing and logging those specific cognitive distortions that are causing you to misinterpret what's going on around you, to devalue your own worth, and to actually label. There are actually names for all of these different algorithms. It's like mind reading, where you assume that that another person is thinking about how stupid you sound, or fortune telling, where you believe what's going to happen and it's going to be bad. And there are all these things. I really recommend the book Feeling Good by Dr. David Burns for this, right? But there are all these different distortions that once you start identifying them, you can say, oh yeah, you can start noticing them right away and say, oh yeah, that's that distortion, right? And I'm not thinking about it clearly, and you can actually change those pathways, essentially rewire that algorithm to think about these things that are happening to you in a more clear way, right? And then that's probably the most effective treatment for depression. It's done better than many antidepressant drugs. So it's powerful stuff.
I was going to ask about depression, and because it's interesting, seeing depression in my family and seeing kids who've dealt with depression. It seemed like it was always talked about as a chemical thing, right? And I come from the cognitive rewiring side, and I know it sometimes comes at odds with what some of these psychiatrists were telling me. and what they
Right.
were telling my daughter, right? And so I like what you're saying more than what sometimes, so what do I know? I don't know anything about the chemicals in the brain.
Yeah, I mean, oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, they hand me a pill and I tend to believe them. And so you're not
Right.
necessarily advocating it's either or, right? Or what do you say? I mean, I just think that I don't see enough in the maybe I just don't look hard enough in the field of depressive studies that, this kind of cognitive therapy is the solution. I don't see that pushed as much. Am I wrong? Or I don't know.
Oh, I don't think you see it pushed as much because I think it's not understood or misunderstood, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, and not to be too cynical here, but it's also not in the interest of pharmaceutical
right, it's not
companies
profitable.
to push this kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
This is the book Lost Connections by Johann Hari. It's really good for kind of pointing out this this trend that's caught on of treating it all as a chemical imbalance in the mind. There are certainly chemical changes that are linked to cognitive changes, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you are changing chemicals by changing your thoughts, and in theory, vice versa. But what is often found is the chemicals, the antidepressants, the SSRIs that people get prescribed, they work really well at first, and then the effect sort of fades over the course of 6 months or a year. And that's some combination of the fact that your sort of body adapts to the increased serotonin that it's getting or whatever changes is being made, and simply the placebo effect, just the fact that you feel like you're taking something that's going to fix you, and that starts having a temporary improvement on your mood. I mean, even before the effects have had time to kick in, you take a pill and you're feeling like, okay, my problems are solved.
Right.
I don't have to
Right.
change my life. I don't have to
Right.
change my mind. And it does seem to me, based on the research, that that cognitive therapy actually making changes to your mind and to your life, right, which is sort of goes into the exposure therapy, behavioral activation side. These are more sustainable ways to change your mind than to just take a chemical and hope it balances things out.
I agree.
Yes, and so something we talked about in pre-show that I do want to get into because I know we're going to run out of time here before too long is the so I a couple of weeks ago or week before last, I was in Alaska and I was doing a fishing trip out in the wilderness, some other friends of mine, and we're just fishing and stuff. And that was totally, everything I was seeing was different. Sleeping outside in a tent, that's different. It was all different. And I noticed that for me personally, a lot of the brain chatter quieted down, kind of more, I won't say I wasn't in a super grateful space, but it just more, visually, I'm just taking in new stuff, right? The computer is like, oh, these are new trees and these are new plants and these are fish and what is this and what is it? So I noticed that my environment definitely had an effect on me. And then when I came back, I noticed that some of the patterns that I don't think are as healthy as I would want to have, I'm not as mindful as I would like to be. I noticed that those just came basically right back online. And so and I've noticed you've talked about it in some of your work. So how important is environment, literal? And when we say environment, I'm not talking about global warming here, like your physical, what you see, what you interact with, the people you're with. I mean, how important is that? And then, what's your perspective on that, I guess?
Yeah, environment is a huge factor on the functioning of your mind, because essentially all of your mental algorithms, or very many of them, are triggered by external inputs,
Mm-hmm.
right? So essentially you're determining what is going to get triggered in your brain by your environment. So yes, in theory, you could choose this, awful war zone of an environment, and you could attempt to make a bunch of changes to your mind exclusively. But I think you have to sort of find a balance and say, okay, what is the best path to making these changes for my mind? Because yeah, you spend enough time in a hectic, stressful environment, that is going to create long-term changes to you, and it's going to take a long time of getting out of that environment for it to start rewiring itself. So you are going to find that these patterns sort of come right back when you get back in that stressful environment. But a lot of what I talk about the environment for is actually changing your habits, changing your
Mm-hmm.
behaviors, because it's been found that if you spend time around people who are overweight, you are like significantly more likely to be overweight, right? And there are all these different examples you can go through of the environment actually influencing your habits, right? So a lot of people have this view that self-control and developing good habits is all about willpower. It's all about this brute force, pushing through it and getting up motivated every day and whatever it is. And often there are these sort of strategic, creative design opportunities that can save you from having to use willpower. And environment is a huge one of those. Consequences are another one that you don't hear about quite as much, right? You can change the consequence of your habits sort of proactively so that certain things that are good for you are more rewarding and things that are bad for you are less rewarding, right? So one example of this that I'm really interested in is called a token economy, where you essentially, every time you do a certain good habit, you give yourself some kind of reward, whether it's a poker chip or a mark in a notebook or something, and you associate that with something else. So you can be allowed to listen to an audiobook that you really like, or watch an episode of a TV show, or go to a concert every time you get a certain number of these tokens. And you essentially create a new consequence so that you're training good habits by making them rewarding. Eventually you come to associate that token you give yourself with the exciting stimulus, and it becomes a reward in itself. And this has actually been shown to be effective in some studies that have been done on it. So it's a really interesting way to sort of hijack that desire.
When we at Next Level, we talk a lot about gamification, right? And so, the application that we'll be rolling out here shortly, it's a lot of it is gamification. When you do certain things within the application that will add value to your life, the bell rings and the points come on and you win, you win accolades. And then eventually we may have it so you can trade those tokens, points in for stuff, t-shirts and hats and other stuff, right? So, and so that's one way, we're looking at that. What I think is right in alignment with what you're doing is how do you motivate yourself? And I certainly believe that not motivation, but well, you could say trying to motivate yourself, willpower is weak. I think all those things. I typically look at my life and say, I'm just going to default that I'm a lazy human being, and I know I shouldn't use that language from a neurolinguistic standpoint, but I'm a lazy human being. So how am I going to design my life so that it's pulling me in, and growth is a natural byproduct of my schedule, right? Versus having it be just, I wake up, I'm an emotional creature. We're all emotional creatures. I wake up and some days I'm like, like this morning I was like, I could just stay in bed, right? I could just sleep. But no, my life has meetings and it has people, it has this podcast, right? And then by the end of the day, I'm kind of like, full up again because but had I just let it be emotional, it would have never happened, right? So when you're talking habits and stuff, we have to pre-program our lives for what we want out of them, right? Not what I want for you or you want for me, but what do I want for my life? We have to understand that, I believe, right? And then program it through habits, because willpower is so weak, right? I mean, it's not sustainable, right?
Right. Yeah. No. Really interesting what you're talking about with the app, because I've had a vision for a software that would work in a lot of those same ways for a long time for just optimizing your mind.
Right.
A lot of people are starting to do interesting things like that. So I'm really curious where that'll go. But I mean, one tool that I've talked about before that I just love is called FocusMate. And I basically use this to write my book. It's essentially calls itself a virtual co-working tool. And it basically allows you to schedule periods of time where you are going to meet up with a random person over a video chat, and both of you are trying to get something done over the next hour, right? So first of all, if I want to lay in bed, if I don't feel like getting up, I can tell myself, oh, well, I've got this call scheduled with this person. It's already set up. I don't want to, be a no-show. So that kind of pushes you. But then also, it's amazing how much more effective you are at reaching your goals when you've got this set up, because you basically just talk to the person for a minute at the beginning of the call, say, this is what I want to get done over the next hour. They tell you what they want to get done. And then you just stay on in the background, and then you check back in at the end. So I would say, I want to write 1,000 words over the next hour. And they would tell me what they want to do. And then I would work so hard to not have to tell them that I didn't hit my goal.
Right.
So it's a really powerful tool. It's surprisingly powerful because we don't realize how strong our social drive is, that we don't even want to disappoint a complete stranger who might live on the other side of the world. So yeah, there are a lot of these methods. I mean, you can use your financial drive too. There are apps that let you create a financial contract to work out a certain number of times, and if you don't do it, then someone who is meeting their goals will get your money essentially, and vice versa. So it's all about hijacking these drives that are all already in place and making the ideal scenario essentially the path of least resistance.
It ties into, I love what you're saying, and you know, when you go into coaching and stuff like that, that's the power of having a coach, right? You say, well, when I see you next week, you better, I'm going to ask you about this, and you're right. It's a huge motivator. But talking about limiting beliefs and self-doubt, that's something that's come up for me time and time again over the last 10 years as I got into more coaching and even introspecting myself. You talk about that if we're starting this road, like, okay, we're getting into mindfulness, we're looking at this now, we're going to rewire this algorithm or the algorithms. A lot of it starts too on this idea of beliefs, right? And taking an honest look at what a belief is. And I know for me, when I stopped looking at beliefs as either right or wrong, right? They're just either, I look at them as more of like they're either add value or they take value away. And that's kind of what you're talking about here on approaching these cognitive biases or getting real with them, right? That's kind of another step. I know we don't got a lot of time to get into this, but I just wanted to at least bring that up, that, right? This is an important part of the journey. And what you were talking about just now, it kind of reminded me of that, right? That we have to get real with these cognitive biases. Am I on the right track?
Absolutely, yeah. There are books at this point that document like thousands of cognitive biases that we all have systemically. So it's not just a bad belief or a bad decision. It's something that affects many of our decisions. And there are ways that you can, become better at dealing with them, become more aware of them, and even eliminate these cognitive biases, right? So, a simple example, you've got the confirmation bias. That's a pretty huge one, right? We have this tendency to want to seek out things that basically reinforce our existing worldview.
Yeah. So that's why I'm gonna find news sources and people around me that's just gonna support everything that I believe.
If I'm against something, I'm gonna start talking to other people. If I'm against the current administration, I'm gonna watch Fox News, right? I mean, that's what we're talking about, right? I mean, I'm gonna reinforce. Right. I look at it as a position. We talk about position. I'm gonna become positional, and I'm gonna justify then my behavior based on my position, right?
Right. And once you sort of label and start noticing these patterns around you, you can become increasingly aware of these things. So you can start catching yourself when you're typing in a Google search that you're kind of skewing in one direction or you're kind of ignoring some of the results because they don't tell you what you want to hear. You start noticing that in real time and you start saying, okay, well, this is a bias. I need to work against this, The planning fallacy is another example. You can get to where you are much better at predicting how well you'll meet deadlines just by observing how well you've met the same kind of deadline before instead of just asking yourself, well, how long do I feel like this will take? Because very often it's like triple what we feel like it'll take at the time. So there are a lot of these biases, and some of them very much are these sort of self-limiting beliefs where we have this bias where we tell ourselves that I'm not this kind of person. I'm not the creative type of person. I'm not a business person, whatever it may be, right? We've got this bias that probably is rooted, in pretty deeply and maybe even into our childhood, right? It simply may not be true if we haven't really experimented and shown ourselves that whether the bias is true or not, we may end up choosing a life that's way worse than we could have just because we've convinced ourselves that we are or aren't a certain type of person, right?
I'd say we hadn't even scratched the surface. I mean, I'm looking through the chapters in your book, and we talked a lot about the theory and the practice of psychitecture. We just touched a little bit on the cognitive biases. We haven't talked about how to rewire them, really. Values and methods of introspection, cognitive self-mastery and wisdom, emotional algorithms and the art of restructuring desires and the keys to modulating them, emotional self-mastery, self-direction and its impediments. on and on and on.
All
right?
light stuff.
All light stuff.
Light, super light stuff. Nothing there to really.
Right.
I'm sorry. I use too much sarcasm.
No.
When my brain starts to fill up too much, I use sarcasm as a
I
way
understand.
to self-soothe.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I was just gonna say is like, kind of like what's that, Pulp Fiction, and Samuel Jackson's like, check out the big brain on Ryan instead of Brad, right?
Yeah.
That's all I'm thinking is like, check out the big brain on Ryan. No, but I love what you're doing, man.
Yeah.
I'm
fascinating.
I like I said, I got through the first 3 chapters this morning, and I'm like, okay, I'm vested. I'm gonna really dive into this. I think you're onto something really great,
yeah,
Ryan.
I agree. I mean, I was, when we were visiting, one, I was, my brain was processing, but 2, I was just thinking, I really feel like you're a thought leader in this space, and I think you've come at it from a very pragmatic standpoint.
From a fresh standpoint too.
Yeah, but that's the other, pragmatic maybe because it is fresh. It's not
Probably.
it's not, and so I do appreciate that, and I appreciate how you put it together, and certainly, will love to see, your work as it develops, and like you said, you're working on a project on anxiety, and I think that's a huge, when you just look nationwide, right, the number 1 seller of medications, antidepressants. So, I think there's a huge field there of people that could really use help in that area without medicating, right? And so, I certainly, would love to see when you get that done. We'd love to have you come back on the show and visit about that. And certainly, we recommend the book. You've got 2 books actually, right?
The book of self-mastery quotes, and then of course designing the mind.
Right?
Yeah,
the principles of psychitecture. So awesome stuff.
I really appreciate that. I mean, this book is 10 years in the making ultimately. So
Right.
I did pack a lot into it, but I hope it can sort of serve as this manual, but also this kind of way of instilling a mindset that I hope to flesh out increasingly. So I'm hoping this book is only the beginning, really. I've got, a lot more books planned. I've got courses and, a deck of introspection cards that I'm hoping to come out with. So, and the book of self-mastery is a much smaller, sort of bite-sized type of book. If you don't want to go as deep analytically, I think that can be really valuable. And I'm actually going to give it away to anyone listening.
Oh, that's right.
This.
Yes, that's right.
designingthemind.org/free-mastery. We'll have the link to that in the show notes, and make sure that people can.
And they can get that on your website. Is that right? I mean, it's free download on your website.
Yeah, if they join that, if they put in their name and email, they'll get an email with it, and then they can either stay subscribed or unsubscribe to the emails. But you'll get that digital book when you sign up.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you for that.
I signed up for it myself, and we'll have links to that in the show notes. So if you guys want to find this, again, it's designingthemind.org/free-mastery, or you can go to the link on our show notes at nextlevelmethod.com to find this on this specific show. Man, I'm excited to get to know you even further. Hopefully this is just the beginning of staying in touch, and we're always here to support you at Next Level Method. I really appreciate all that you're doing. How else can people connect with you?
Again, thanks so much for having me, guys. I've really enjoyed the conversation. It's been, really thought-provoking, and if you want to find more, I would say designingthemind.org is the best place to start. You can kind of look around the articles, videos from there. You can join the email list if you want, and there's another free guide that will come with your book of self-mastery, just kind of a 50-page basic guide on psychitecture. So that's really the best place to start diving in, and you can sort of branch out from there. But
perfect.
Ryan, so great, man.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah.
We really appreciate it, and just all the thoughts around it. And I know it'll spur lots of, for our listeners and ourselves, just, you plant those seeds, right? And they grow.
Thanks for coming on, man.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to the Next Level Method podcast. If you found some value in this, tell somebody about the show. Tell your friends, tell your spouse, tell your kids, let them know all about Next Level Method. And go to nextlevelmethod.com to learn more and join our community. Thanks for tuning in.